There are moments in history when a single forgotten page can shake the foundations of everything we believe about the past. And tonight we open one such page. Welcome to the Unveiled Scroll, a place where lost chronicles whisper again, and shadows of history step quietly back into the light. If you are drawn to hidden stories, buried beneath the dust of centuries, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this channel so these forgotten voices can continue to be heard. Tonight, we uncover a tale known only to a handful of scholars and archivists, a strange and unsettling chronicle sometimes referred to as forbidden. Royal Chronicle reveals buried kingdom awakening a terrible secret. According to scattered manuscripts preserved in obscure archives, sometime in the late 17th century, a small expedition of royal scribes was quietly dispatched under the authority of an unnamed European court. Their mission was not conquest, not diplomacy, but documentation. They were tasked with traveling to a remote valley said to exist somewhere beyond the mapped borders of several empires, a place where rumor spoke of an abandoned kingdom that history itself seemed to have erased. The leader of this expedition was a man named Voren, a meticulous historian whose reputation rested upon his relentless devotion to truth. Voren believed history was not merely written by victors, but buried by them, and he had long suspected that entire chapters of the world as past had been deliberately sealed away. When the sealed orders arrived bearing the royal crest, he reportedly wrote in his private journal that destiny had finally opened a door he had spent his entire life searching for. The expedition departed quietly, traveling through mountain passes and forgotten trade routes until the landscape itself seemed to grow silent around them. Voren's surviving journal entries describe a valley hidden by towering cliffs and dense fog, a place where no village smoke rose and no road remained intact. Yet scattered among the overgrown hills stood the unmistakable remains of stone structures, too deliberate to be accidents of nature. Crumbling arches leaned toward the sky like the ribs of a giant skeleton, and Muscovite statues stared blindly into the mist, as if waiting for witnesses who would never return. According to Voren, the architecture did not resemble any known kingdom of that era. The carvings depicted figures wearing crowns shaped like spirals of flame, and many of the statues bore expressions that seemed strangely sorrowful rather than triumphant. But the most disturbing discovery came when the expedition entered what appeared to be the central hall of the ruined city. Beneath layers of collapsed stone, they uncovered a circular chamber whose walls were engraved with hundreds of symbols arranged in spiraling patterns. Voren initially believed them to be ceremonial inscriptions. Yet the deeper his team studied them, the more unsettling the realization became. These markings appeared to be records, not of victories or laws, but of disappearances. Names repeated over and over, followed by a single symbol resembling a dark eclipse, swallowing the sun. At first the pattern seemed random, but after days of careful comparison, Voren noticed something chilling. The names were listed by year, and the numbers steadily grew larger as time passed. Something had been happening in that kingdom, something so devastating that the record keepers had felt compelled to carve each loss directly into stone, as if writing into eternity itself. Yet nowhere in the chamber did they find mention of war, famine, or plague. Instead, one final inscription appeared at the center of the spiraling wall, carved deeper than all the others, a single sentence written in an archaic dialect that Voren struggled to translate. When he finally deciphered it, he reportedly stared at the stone in silence for nearly an hour before writing his next journal entry with trembling hands. Because according to Voren's translation, the final line did not describe how the kingdom ended. It described what had awakened beneath it. What Voren read on that ancient stone unsettled him in a way no historical puzzle ever had before. Because the sentence did not speak in the language of legend or myth, but in the calm tone of a warning meant for those who would come later. The inscription translated roughly to a chilling declaration: "We sealed the silence beneath us, yet the silence remembers." Voren returned to his journal that night and wrote that the words seemed less like history and more like a confession carved by a people who knew their fate had already been decided. For several days, the expedition continued their work in the ruined chamber, carefully tracing symbols and copying the spiraling inscriptions into their ledgers. As they studied the carvings more closely, another disturbing pattern emerged. The names of the vanished citizens were grouped not by family or profession, but by location within the city itself. Entire districts appeared to have emptied in sequence, as if the disappearances had spread slowly through the kingdom like an unseen tide. Voren and his assistants began mapping the sequence across the ruins they had already explored, and what they discovered sent a quiet tension through the camp. The disappearances seemed to move in a widening circle outward from a single point deep beneath the city's oldest structure, a massive palace whose foundation stones were far older than the rest of the ruins. The palace stood at the highest hill in the valley, its broken towers rising like blackened candles against the pale sky. Even in decay, it carried a strange gravity, as if the land itself bent slightly toward it. When Voren first approached the structure, he described an overwhelming stillness, the kind that presses upon the ears until even breathing sounds too loud. Inside the palace, the expedition discovered halls stripped bare of furniture, tapestries reduced to dust, and walls whose murals had faded into ghostly shadows of their former colors. Yet the deeper they ventured into the structure, the more frequently they encountered the same spiral symbol that appeared in the chamber below the city. It was carved into pillars, etched into doorways, and sometimes scratched crudely into stone as if by trembling hands. In one narrow corridor, they found something that Voren later called the most haunting artifact of the entire expedition. It was a small bronze bell hanging from a rusted chain, positioned above a staircase descending into darkness beneath the palace. The bell bore an inscription in the same dialect as the spiraling wall below, but this message was shorter, simpler, and perhaps far more terrifying. Voren translated the words as, "Ring, only when the silence returns." No one in the expedition could explain what that warning meant. The staircase beneath the bell descended into a series of underground passages whose walls were lined with ancient stone blocks older than any other structure they had encountered in the valley. The air grew colder with each step downward, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the tunnels as though the earth itself were hollow beneath them. Voren's journal reveals that at this point, several members of the expedition began urging him to abandon the investigation. Something about the tunnels created a quiet dread that none of them could fully describe. Yet Voren refused to leave. For him, the ruins had already revealed too much to turn back now. If the spiral record spoke the truth, then the fate of the vanished kingdom was not a mystery lost to time, but a story deliberately buried. And somewhere beneath the palace, beneath the oldest stones of the valley, lay the answer to why an entire civilization had chosen to carve its own warning into eternity rather than allow its secret to disappear with him. The descent beneath the palace marked a turning point in Voren's Chronicle, for from that moment forward his writing changed. The calm and methodical tone of a scholar slowly gave way to something heavier, as though the deeper he walked into the earth, the more he felt the weight of a forgotten fear pressing against his thoughts. The underground passages twisted beneath the palace like the roots of an ancient tree, branching and folding upon themselves in ways that suggested the tunnels had not been built all at once, but expanded, gradually, across generations. Torches flickered against the stone walls, as Voren and his companions moved carefully through the narrow corridors, each step echoing into darkness that seemed reluctant to release its silence. After nearly an hour of slow descent, they reached a vast chamber whose ceiling disappeared into shadow above them. At the center stood a circular platform surrounded by tall pillars carved with the same spiraling symbol they had seen throughout the ruins above. Yet here, the carvings were far more elaborate, depicting figures kneeling before a deep pit that opened in the middle of the platform. Voren approached the edge cautiously, lowering his lantern toward the opening, but the light vanished into darkness long before it reached any visible bottom. According to his journal, the pit appeared not to be a natural formation, but something deliberately excavated, its inner walls smooth and reinforced with fitted stone. Around its rim were dozens of smaller inscriptions, each carved with a careful precision that suggested ritual importance. When Voren began translating them, the meaning slowly revealed itself with unsettling clarity. The inscriptions were records of offerings, but they were not offerings of gold, crops, or livestock. They were names. Each line documented a person presented to what the text repeatedly described as the keeper beneath silence. The realization spread quietly through the expedition as Voren read the words aloud. This underground chamber was not simply part of the city's architecture. It had been the center of a ritual system that stretched across generations. The spiral markings throughout the city now appeared less like warnings and more like a map of a growing obligation, a pattern of sacrifices expanding outward through the kingdom as if feeding something that lived far below the earth. Yet one question haunted Voren more than any other. If the people of the kingdom had willingly recorded these offerings, why had they eventually vanished themselves? The answer began to emerge when they examined the final set of inscriptions carved closest to the pit. These markings were more hurried, their lines uneven as though etched during a moment of growing desperation. The translations revealed a shift in tone from reverence to dread. Earlier inscriptions described the offerings as necessary to preserve harmony between the world above and the silence below. But the final records told a different story. The keeper beneath silence had begun to demand more. Names once recorded monthly were suddenly listed weekly, then daily. Entire households appeared in the carvings, followed by the symbol of the dark eclipse Voran had seen in the chamber above. One final message, etched with such force that fragments of stone had cracked around the letters, carried a sentence that chilled the entire expedition. When Voran translated it aloud, we fed the silence until it learned our voices. Now it calls for all of them. At that moment, Voran wrote that the chamber felt less like a ruin and more like a wound carved into the earth. A place where an ancient agreement had slowly collapsed into catastrophe, and standing at the edge of that bottomless pit, lantern trembling in his hand, he began to understand why the final warning had been carved into the spiraling wall above the city. Because whatever the people of that forgotten kingdom had tried to contain beneath their palace, they had ultimately failed. Elias Voran would later write that the final moments of his expedition were the most difficult he had ever committed to paper. It's a rare thing in history, he noted, for a scholar to stand so close to the living edge of a forgotten catastrophe. Imagine standing there, beside that vast, dark pit, deep beneath the ruins of an ancient palace. The members of the expedition felt the full, crushing weight of the inscriptions that spiraled around them, covering every inch of the chamber walls. For generations, people had stood in this very spot, believing they were maintaining the delicate balance of their world. They offered names into the darkness of the pit, a sacrifice in exchange for peace and prosperity on the surface. But as Voran and his team examined the carvings, they uncovered a far more tragic narrative. The final inscriptions told a story of slow, dawning horror. The presence they had been trying to appease, the entity dwelling in the depths, had begun to change. Its demands grew, its nature shifted, and the peace they had purchased for so long was beginning to crumble. Voran, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail, carefully studied the deepest set of markings, the ones closest to the pit's edge. There, he discovered what appeared to be the final entry ever carved into the stone. This last inscription was different. It wasn't a name. It was a decision, a desperate, final act, made by the last rulers of the kingdom. According to the translation Voran preserved in his journal, the royal council had reached a terrible conclusion. The only way to silence the growing demands from below was to sever the connection completely. They ordered the palace sealed, the network of tunnels collapsed, and the ancient rituals forbidden forever, hoping to entomb the entity and its influence. But the text contained a chilling premonition, a hint that their decision came far too late. The silence beneath the earth, once a passive void, had already begun to answer the voices of those above. It was no longer just listening. It was responding. Voran recorded in his journal that, as he read those final, fateful words aloud, a faint sound seemed to drift up from the pit itself. At first, it was nothing more than the whisper of distant air moving through stone corridors, a sound common in deep, underground spaces. But the longer the expedition stood there, frozen in place, the more the sound seemed to change. It began to form patterns, faint and almost imperceptible, that echoed strangely against the chamber walls. Several members of the team, their faces pale, stepped back from the edge immediately. They insisted, their voices trembling, that they had heard something else buried within the rising echo, something that resembled a whisper. Voran himself, ever the pragmatist, never claimed to have heard actual words. Yet his final journal entries from that day reveal a growing, knowing unease that even he, a man of science and reason, could not fully dismiss. The chamber, which had been silent upon their arrival, now seemed to breathe with a slow, deep rhythm, like air being drawn into and expelled from some unseen, colossal lung deep within the earth. After several agonizing minutes, Voran made a decision that would end the expedition and define his legacy. He ordered the team to leave the tunnels immediately. They were to seal the entrance to the underground passages as best they could before departing the valley for good. For the scholars who would later study Voran's recovered journal, this sudden choice was completely out of character. This was Elias Voran, a historian renowned for his relentless, almost obsessive curiosity. To turn back from such a monumental discovery seemed unthinkable. Yet Voran's final written lines from the valley offer a possible, and deeply unsettling, explanation. He wrote that history sometimes survives not because everything is discovered, but because certain things remain buried. Some doors, he implied, are best left unopened. The expedition left the valley the very next morning. They collapsed parts of the palace staircase behind them and marked the location only within Voron's most private, sealed archive. The ruined kingdom was never officially recorded in any royal documents, and the valley itself, unnamed and uncharted, slowly disappeared from maps as the decades turned into centuries. Voron's journal, however, remained. It was hidden away among sealed manuscripts for more than 200 years, its pages quietly preserving the memory of a civilization that had carved its fear into stone spirals beneath a silent, watchful sky. And so, we're left with a haunting question, carried across time by a forgotten historian. Did the people of that lost kingdom destroy themselves in a desperate attempt to contain something terrifying beneath their world? Or did they simply vanish, when the silence they had worshipped for so long finally answered back? If this hidden chronicle stirred your curiosity and you wish to uncover more forgotten mysteries of history, remember to like the video, subscribe to the Unveiled Scroll, and share this story so the echoes of the past continue to travel forward. Until our next journey into the shadows of history, thank you for listening, and may your curiosity always guide you toward the stories the world almost forgot.